guys are crew. Make sure everybody who needs to be up here with you is up here with you. Now we're about to go into ramp freeze, and once we do, you're stuck up here.
Do we have any further update on time on something 220?
From everything that I'm hearing, yes. It might be a little give or take on either end. Yep.
Z200. Fixed lines.
Yeah, Kira, lovely to be here. I'll tell you where we are. Relationship is
for me?
Well, I was down there, but she's like prompting because it's going to be okay, you just said. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey guys, we're seeing the plane starting to arrive. You are seeing pictures now of the plane carrying King Charles and Queen Camilla as it lands at Joint Base Andrews here in the Washington, D.C. area. I am Meg Kennard, again here back with the Associated Press live stream coverage of the King and Queen's visit to the United States this week. As this plane lands, it begins a 4-day visit for the King and Queen in and around Washington. They'll be here in D.C. for a slew of events, as well as traveling to New York City and events in Virginia before they leave on Thursday. So you're seeing these images now. Again, this has been a long journey across the Atlantic for the King and Queen, but this now marks King Charles' first touchdown on American soil as the sitting British monarch. He has clearly been to the United States a bunch of times, I believe 19 as he was serving as Prince of Wales, but now he is clearly the monarch in his own right. And so this is a big moment for him, the first official visit as king himself, again traveling with Queen Camilla, who will be attending some of these events with him and also a few of her own. So we are seeing that plane taxi at Joint Base Andrews. The King and Queen, when they emerge from that plane, will be heading over to the White House for a first visit, just a kind of an official greeting with President Trump and the First Lady. And then from there, they will proceed across Washington to the British ambassador's residence for what we expect will be a very traditional British garden party. We'll talk a little bit more about that event later in this broadcast coverage, but I can tell you the Associated Press got some behind the scenes access to all of the planning that has gone into that event, and it should be very special on a nice spring day here in Washington. Temperatures are feeling pretty nice outside, so they hopefully should have a good time. But as we continue to watch this plane moving across the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews, just a little bit more of the schedule that the King and Queen are going to be seeing over the next couple of days. Tomorrow is really the big day for the King and Queen as they're here in Washington. The King will be having a bilateral meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office. At the same time, Queen Camilla will have her own meeting with First Lady Melania Trump. Later in the day, King Charles will make a joint address to Congress. That's only the second time that a sitting British monarch has done so. Of course, the only other time was his mother, the late Queen Elizabeth. And then tomorrow evening at the White House, there will be a state dinner, something that we often see accompany foreign leaders' trips to Washington to meet with the president. But clearly, with the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain, this is a very monumental moment. And of course, we should mention that this trip by the King and Queen is coming this year specifically to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence. I have heard it mentioned by a few folks here around Washington, and I'm sure that we may feel a bit of humor coming from the King, considering that our Declaration of Independence was from his country 250 years ago. That's not a moment lost, certainly, but with the close relationship between these two countries now, since then, this is a commemoration of that. On Wednesday, the King and Queen will formally bid adieu to Washington and head to New York City for a memorial ceremony surrounding 9/11, September 11th. But there's also, aside from a lot of the politics in this trip, there is a lot of community engagement. That's something that's always been of primacy to the King. Certainly a lot of different groups and organizations and causes with which he's involved himself, and he will be doing some of that in Harlem with a community meeting, and also be meeting with some business leaders at Rockefeller Center. The Queen will be participating in a literary engagement during that time. They'll also have a cultural reception, and then on Thursday be heading to a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery here back in the General Washington area, and participating in several events throughout Virginia, a community block party, a nature engagement, and also a horse racing event. So we'll talk more about those throughout our coverage, but just a preview of the rest of this four-day trip for the King and Queen. As I was noting, there is a lot of politics underneath this trip. Clearly, the King is a monarch. He is not the head of British government, so to speak. He is the head of state. But for us in the United States, clearly we don't have a monarch. That's what that whole Declaration of Independence was about 250 years ago. But we do have a president. And so for President Trump, he engages with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on a number of issues. But it is to be surmised that some of those same issues may be coming up in these conversations with King Charles. These two leaders have been developing a relationship of their own, going back to the first Trump administration, and then certainly in this last almost year and a half of the second Trump administration. And this visit itself has been in the works for quite some time. It seems that it's kind of feels like it's all kind of come together here at the last minute, but I can tell you from our standpoint in the media, as well as all of the behind the scenes machinations, this is something that President Trump and King Charles have talked about doing for a long time. Of course, President Trump was in Great Britain last year for a visit, for kind of the reverse of this trip, to be spending time with King Charles and Queen Camilla on their turf. And now they've returned the invitation, and the King and Queen are here in the United States. So we will be seeing a lot of these events. We here at the Associated Press will bring you live coverage of all of the events open to the press, and that will include a lot of what I just ran through in that schedule of these 4 days. And in those conversations, there are many things of international import that we can imagine will be coming up. Clearly, the war in Iran is something happening on a global scale that has involved the King's country, as President Trump has launched, along with Israel, this action in the Middle East. And I would be certain to surmise that some of that will be coming up in their conversations, as well as perhaps some of President Trump's consternation when it comes to what he has characterized as lack of support from European leaders for some of his efforts, particularly including the Strait of Hormuz most recently and traffic by tankers through that. And so King Charles, being a monarch, has the opportunity to kind of be in a little bit of a different category in hearing out the president, in kind of considering a lot of these international events, but not being the head of government and therefore officially deciding and declaring what the British government will be doing. So again, it's a different layer to the kind of bilateral arrangements that we see between President Trump and other global leaders as they meet at the White House and in the Oval Office, which will be happening in that bilateral meeting between the two leaders tomorrow. Continuing to see this plane here making that long journey across the very big tarmac there at Joint Base Andrews with King Charles and Queen Camilla. There are many folks lined up there on the tarmac as they will be exiting the plane here shortly, being greeted by an official welcoming party. And tomorrow night, of course, I mentioned there will be that state dinner at the White House. There was also a state dinner during President Trump's visit to Great Britain last September. A point of high honor for foreign leaders to host these kinds of events for each other. We don't always see it happen every time there is a foreign leader, certainly here in the United States and when the president goes abroad to other places. But that's another indicator of the close relationship between these two leaders who will be spending time together this week. Watching the staircase now being wheeled over to the airplane so the King and Queen can make their exit down to the tarmac and officially begin their 4 days of visit here in the United States. Seeing the military greeting party moving over to the staircase, waiting for the King and Queen to emerge. Again, this is King Charles' first official visit to the United States as the sitting British monarch. He's been to this country multiple times during his mother's reign as Queen, but now this is King Charles' first time in the U.S. as King of England. Let's continue to watch these live images now of King Charles and Queen Camilla officially lighting on U.S. territory during their 4-day visit here to the United States to commemorate that 250th anniversary of U.S. independence. We will be along with them as they make their way over to the White House, and then from there to the British ambassador's residence here in Washington for a British garden party. But for now, let's listen in and watch as the King and Queen come here to the United States. You have been watching as King Charles and Queen Camilla officially arrived here in the Washington area for their 4-day visit to the United States to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. I'm Meg Kennard here at the Associated Press Washington headquarters, where we are monitoring our live stream coverage coming from across this city as the King and Queen now make their way to the White House, which you also see on your screen there. First up on their list of official events is an official greeting with President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump at the White House. This is an event I've seen plenty of times, and I know that you've probably seen it on TV at least too, where foreign leaders arrive at the White House to be greeted by the president, and in the case of their spouses also coming, oftentimes the First Lady, to bring them into the White House space, officially welcoming them to this country, and often having a brief moment to sit down and chat. That's what we do expect to be happening with King Charles and Queen Camilla and the first couple, President and Mrs. Trump, as they are expected to have some tea and a chat there at the White House today as their first official event here in Washington. Later on this afternoon, the King and Queen are going to be heading across Washington to the British ambassador's residence. That is where they will take place in a formal British garden party, which is an event I would very much like to go to, but I will be here bringing you our live stream coverage. That is something we'll be talking a little bit later today about with Jack Arresto, our Deputy Bureau Chief here in Washington, who recently got a special behind-the-scenes look at all the planning that it takes to go into pulling off an event like that garden party later on today. So now you're seeing, again, our live shot of the White House now, where the King and Queen are on their way to be greeted by President and Mrs. Trump for their first official event here in Washington. It's going to be a pretty long trip, all things considered, for the first royal couple of the United Kingdom here in the States. They'll be in the D.C. area today and tomorrow before going to New York for a series of events, and then also to Virginia before departing for Bermuda, the next stop on their trip outside of the UK. And as I was saying a little bit earlier, it's a special relationship. That's something that officials in both countries have often talked about when characterizing the way that the US and the UK are connected. Since 250 years ago, obviously the big disagreement that led to the Revolutionary War and our own independence. But since then, there have been a lot of times where British leaders and American leaders are drawn tightly together. That's often happening at the Prime Minister level, which is obviously the head of British government, but also between the American presidents and British royal family and British monarchs. During the very long reign of Queen Elizabeth, King Charles' mother, she came to the United States a number of times and was greeted by a number of U.S. presidents. And her father also developed a close relationship with American presidents when he visited here with FDR. That was the first visit in 1939 that a British monarch had made to the United States. And it was at that meeting where pieces of this relationship really began to draw even closer, clearly on the cusp there of World War II, a time when the US and the UK were very aligned in terms of their efforts to fight for victory in that war. And that's something that we've continued to see developing, not just at the Prime Minister level, but particularly between US presidents and British monarchs, and pretty much since that time almost was Queen Elizabeth II, now until King Charles III. But so it's an event where we anticipate we will have conversations between President Trump and King Charles on a variety of issues, not necessarily just political, but also things that they may share in common and just personal conversations. But underneath all of that, there's clearly going to be policy conversations, political conversations, and the moment in which the world finds itself with still conflict happening in the Middle East, in the war in Iran, and President Trump's difficulties and disagreements with various European leaders, including UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. That is something that is kind of an undercurrent beneath this visit. There is a lot of pomp and circumstance certainly happening in all of these events that are here in the Washington area, but once the events move out of Washington, there will be more of a community engagement feel, just kind of looking at the schedule of everything else that King Charles and Queen Camilla will be taking part in as they travel up to New York to commemorate 9/11. There's also a community engagement event in Harlem. The Queen will be participating in a literacy event in her own right, and then also when they are in Virginia on the final day of their trip, they will be going to Arlington National Cemetery, clearly commemorating some losses there, but then also moving on to different events. King Charles is known for his conservation efforts. That's always been a big piece of his royal persona, so to speak, is advocating for conservation of the natural world, and he is expected to participate in an engagement along those lines when he's in Virginia. Queen Camilla is expected to also attend a horse racing event, which is it's kind of a way for royals while they're here in our country to express some of their personality. It's not just all about these official, Union Jack and Stars and Stripes clad events like we saw there with the arrival with the flags of the two countries, but also just participating in some other things that kind of show their personality to Americans and perhaps develop their own relationships. Let's not forget that the King's mother was queen for a very long time, the longest serving British monarch. And so now as he comes to the U.S. for the first time in that role, this is an opportunity for King Charles to kind of, even though he's been here a lot when he was Prince of Wales, kind of let the American people get to know him a little bit in his own right. And then from Virginia, the royal couple will be departing for Bermuda for the next stage of their trip abroad. So there are a lot of different events that are happening mostly around here in the Washington area and in Virginia, but also that trip up to New York for the King and Queen while they're in the United States. But now they are making their way from Joint Base Andrews, where they landed just moments ago, traversing across to the White House here in Washington, which you again see there on your screen. That's where they will be greeted by President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump before having an informal conversation there at the White House and then going on to the British ambassador's residence for that garden party that I mentioned. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that Jack and I are going to have here in a little bit for the behind-the-scenes access that AP had earlier to all of the planning and preparation that is going into that event. Spring is here in Washington. It feels amazing outside, and so I know that an event like that one is going to be something that will look very special and should feel very nice in terms of temperature. One thing I want to make sure to mention just in terms of the schedule as we look toward the rest of this week, tomorrow is the biggest day for the King's visit here in Washington. He will become only the second sitting British monarch to make an address to a joint session of Congress. That is something that his mother did in 1991. And so this will only be the second time it's ever happened, and King Charles will do that tomorrow. Again, it's an opportunity for the King to talk at a high level about issues that are faced jointly by the United Kingdom and the United States, but also perhaps an opportunity for him to wade into any variety of other issues. It's unusual for us to see foreign leaders addressing the chamber as we will see tomorrow, but as I noted earlier, it's a little bit different in this circumstance because this is a head of he's a monarch and not the head of the British government. So it's a little bit different than when we see, like, Volodymyr Zelensky or Benjamin Netanyahu or other elected foreign leaders coming to address a joint session of Congress. For the monarch, it is a bit different. I'm not going to say it's more than a ceremonial role that he encompasses. He is the head of state, but it's different than being the head of government. And clearly in the United States, our president is kind of both. And so this is it's a little bit of a bifurcated way to think about when leaders from Great Britain come here to the United States. But only the second time that a British monarch has ever done that for Congress. So that will be a big moment. And it is another thing I want to make sure to mention underneath a lot of this is the thought of security, given the shooting that happened on Saturday evening at the White House Correspondents' Dinner here in Washington. There were questions, and we even had an official statement from the British government in the Royal Palace in terms of, is this trip going to still happen, given all of that, given the security concerns of what happened at the Washington Hilton around that event on Saturday night. Clearly, as you just saw, the King and Queen are here, and this visit is expected to go on as normal. But I would also imagine that there will be very heightened security around a lot of the events that are taking place. As you're seeing there, they're on their way to the White House, which is always a very secure location. But as I did some reporting this week, just talking about different security instances at the White House, it's not impervious to things that have happened in the past, and just things to consider when we think about what all goes into planning a visit like this, what goes into securing any area around the U.S. president, and then what happens when you get that U.S. president together with another foreign leader, and what all must go into those kinds of circumstances and planning. So again, when the president and the king are interacting, they will be there at the White House, but then the king will be traveling to Congress, as well as I mentioned other areas like New York City and out into Virginia. He comes with him and brings a lot of his own security and officials. And as you saw on your screen, there was a very long motorcade of all the vehicles that were traveling along with him. One of the things I noticed, and I wonder if you did too, is on the airplane in which the king and queen traveled, to the side of the door through which they exited, you see the royal cipher, which is a linking of a monarch's initial with R, signaling that they are the monarch. And it's funny, you know, I've grown up for years just recognizing the cipher that went along with Queen Elizabeth II, the king's mother. And I think when I saw the plane just now, to see that C and R linked, C obviously for Charles, I'm pretty sure that's the first time that I really can think about noticing that and seeing that in real life. And that's just a little royal trivia nugget for you out there who have been observing these images coming in and maybe, you know, noticing different things about what you're seeing. And so that was the one that I felt that I wanted to point out also. The state dinner, as I pointed out, is going on tomorrow evening at the White House. We expect there to be a big crowd and a lot of dignitaries and officials who will be on hand for that. The last state dinner that happened was in 2007, the last state dinner between a British monarch and a U.S. president. That was 2007 when Queen Elizabeth was here with President George W. Bush. And as it happens, that ended up being her last visit to the United States writ large. So now when we look back on the history of the relationship between U.S. presidents and British monarchs, 2007 is the last state dinner that was held in honor of a British monarch, and that was the last time that Queen Elizabeth was here in this country. The White House is always a lovely place. There are beautiful grounds and a lot of different shrubs and flowers, and now, as I mentioned, it's spring in D.C., so everything seems to be in bloom. But the White House has been undergoing a lot of work there on the grounds to really make sure that everything is in tip-top shape and very, very special for this visit by the King and Queen. When you put that together with a state dinner and think about all of the machinations that go into just planning for an event like that, there are hundreds of staff that need to be brought in to be doing everything from beautifying the grounds to getting everything in order for the many, many guests who will be coming in their finery tomorrow night for this state dinner. And it's weeks and weeks of planning, not just for that event, although there is a lot of protocol to be considered whenever there's a head of state who is visiting the White House. But this whole trip has been in the works for months. It kind of feels like it comes together all of a sudden, you know, where all we can do is talk about the King and Queen coming to Washington. But this has really been in the planning stages for a very, very long time. And we in the media have been working with counterparts at the White House and through the British ambassador as well to make sure that we have access so we can bring you the live images that we will be bringing you today. It's also worth pointing out that this is the first state dinner to be happening at the White House without the East Wing, which was demolished last year by the Trump administration to make way for that ballroom that President Trump has said he wants to see on the site of the White House to have state dinners as well as other events in the future. But it used to be, if you're familiar with White House architecture, it was that entrance there at the East Wing, which was how people came into the complex for state dinners. And so it will be very interesting tomorrow, to see how that all is set up without all of the East Wing and that area. It's definitely going to look different. There are always tents that accompany these events to kind of house all the people who come for these large events. That's something that President Trump has said that's a reason why he wants to push for the ballroom, because the tents, in his mind, he says it should be something that's more permanent and more glamorous than that, and less pervious to weather or rain or whatever could befall anyone dressed up to try to get in there. So now, instead of going in through that East Wing entrance, guests will be coming in through the front door, which is not typically a piece of the White House that we see large numbers of people going in and out of. So that'll be something interesting to watch for this time. And we do also understand that the king himself will be welcomed on the South Portico rather than the North Portico of the White House. That's another change and a tweak that is different from how we typically see these kinds of arrivals coming into the White House. So, you know, we don't always have this kind of a situation to keep on the lookout for, but with all of these changes, particularly as they've been happening on the grounds of the White House since last year, when the East Wing all of a sudden was taken away and plans for the ballroom started to happen, it'll be interesting, at least for political nerds like me, to watch and see how everything looks a little bit different. And one other thing that I want to point out, just in terms of culture, is the very first thing that will be happening for the royal couple and for the American first couple is tea. And that is one of the most British traditions that I can think of. And so to see that, you know, that's a way that President and Mrs. Trump will be welcoming the King and Queen to their home, to the White House. We don't always see something that formal for a visiting head of state, but since it is such a British tradition, I would imagine that the head of White House protocol, who was one of those people you saw on the tarmac greeting the King and Queen as they arrived, I would imagine that that is something that she has been thinking about and taking seriously in terms of trying to get together all of the details for these events. There's another thing that often happens when foreign leaders come to the White House, and that's an exchange of gifts. And we don't always know exactly how that transpires or what those gifts are, but we will be watching to see if that is something that happens during this visit. Obviously, King Charles and President Trump have gotten to know each other and have worked together and even have hosted one another, such as when the president was in the UK last year. But with this first official visit for the king as sitting monarch, it's a little bit different. And so we'll see if that is part of what transpires today. Another thing to point out is this is only the second state dinner for President Trump of this term. And again, as I mentioned, it's the first one to happen in this new construct without the East Wing, which played a pivotal role in state dinners of the past. But this is only the second time that he's hosted a foreign leader in this way. Obviously, the president hosts a lot of foreign leaders at the White House many, many times throughout the year. But there's not always a state dinner that accompanies those visits. The last time that President Trump held a state dinner for a visiting official was Saudi Arabia's leader in November. So that's been several months, and clearly a lot has been going on, and many foreign leaders have been at the White House since then. But this is obviously also another way to show to the King and Queen and to Great Britain the honor and import that the Trump administration and the president himself are hoping to convey as they put on this event, which is not always the case for every foreign leader that is visiting the White House. And we do know, one thing that we know about state dinners is that the First Lady, Melania Trump, takes them very seriously. She's integral to the planning of these kinds of events, of so many of the details. And so I highly anticipate that the menu for it will be something that she has been working on very hard. We often get details for exactly what's on the menu a little bit before the event themselves. And it's everything from the menu to the decor to the entertainment that is picked out. It's, like I mentioned, with the chief of protocol for the White House, it's something that is often tailored to the country of origin for the foreign leader who's visiting. And so there's a lot of specificity, but also wanting to showcase America and American cuisine and American style. And one thing that I learned when I was researching about state dinners in preparation for this week is there has been in recent years somewhat of a transition away from more of a heavy French style of cuisine on the menu to lighter fare that really showcases more American styles and American ingredients. And so that's something that I think has been it's always on my mind. Maybe I'm hungry, I don't know, that I'm thinking about food, but I'm interested to see what's on the menu for the state dinner. There's one thing that we also know that the First Lady will be sharing with the royals is the new beehive on the south lawn of the White House. That is something that really just came out this week. It is itself a replica of the White House. My colleague Darlene Superville has been doing some reporting around all of this, and it's something that we anticipate that the First Lady will be showing off. This has been another big project for the First Lady. We always see First Ladies putting their mark, so to speak, on the White House grounds with different projects, and this has been one that Melania Trump has been working on and will be showing off as she gives a bit of a tour. Clearly there are a lot of new facets and features at the White House during this second Trump administration. The Rose Garden, for example, has been made into somewhat of a patio type space. So that'll be something that they will also get a look at. But that plus that new outdoor space plus this new beehive project, which is a replica of the White House, and the grounds in general. Again, I know I keep saying it, but we don't always get a nice spring in Washington. And since it is so nice, it's good that this is happening during the visit of the King and Queen, because it really provides Washington writ large, but also the President and the First Lady to quite easily show off some of the nice surroundings there at the White House and across Washington. It's always, I love being here. It's always nice to be in Washington, but it feels even better when it's nice outside and it's not cold or raining, and that's certainly not the case today. So it should be a lovely time for them to be at the White House and also at the British ambassador's residence for that garden party later on today. I think that it's almost time for the King to be arriving at the White House, so we are going to leave you now with this live picture, and you will see as the King and Queen are pulling up there at the White House for the official greeting with President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump. As I mentioned, after they have had their conversation, they will be moving on to the British ambassador's residence for that garden party, and we will be back to talk about that in just a bit.
Thank you.